Hola y'all, welcome back to my channel. You are watching Shelly Flowers Reads and Writes, where I talk about all things related to reading and writing. So guys, it is currently September. It has been a couple weeks since I've been able to consistently upload a video. I am now a 32-year-old lady, so that's exciting. But yeah, it's been a crazy couple weeks. School started officially. I have students. I teach face-to-face 5 times a week, and I also have an additional 70-ish students that I teach online. So in total, I'm teaching about 180 kids this year, which is a lot. And with that, I knew that this might have happened, but I just did not pace out the videos that I had pre-recorded the right way. So now I'm getting back on the wagon and I'm fixing that with my videos that I have coming up. Today, I'm going to be doing a wrap-up of my Sealey challenge because unfortunately I failed at the challenge. I did not finish all of the books that I was hoping to finish. I think I got about 15 books done, so that's halfway, and that's really like 1 book every 2 days in the month of August. But my goal was to read 31 books. The main thing that happened was that I had to order some books from the bookstore and they never came. And then I had this whole stack of poetry books right behind me here, but none of them were just interesting me, and I've become a bit of a mood reader lately, so it all just kind of fell to shit. But I did get a couple more books done, so I want to talk about those in this video now. The next book that I read this past couple weeks in August for the Sealey challenge, Not My White Savior by Julian Lee. This book, I believe I rated 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. It is the story of Julian Lee, who was a transracially adopted woman, adopted into a white Christian American family, but she was born in South Korea, I believe. And it was just a really interesting perspective, because I think oftentimes when we hear about transracial adoption stories, we oftentimes focus on the family either doing the adopting or giving up their child for adoption, but we don't actually get to hear from the perspective of the person being adopted. And that's what I really loved about this book. I am someone who has always wanted to adopt children, and the older I get, the more I wonder if that is actually the right choice for me, because there's so much that goes into it. And I think this book really spells it out. The family that she was adopted into in some ways did not fully accept her identity. That resulted in a lot of issues for her as she became an adult, and it resulted in this sort of sense of loss, the sense of displacement, and I just found all of that to be really powerful. And there was even some talk about like becoming an American citizen, and I think that's such an interesting thing, because that's not something that's talked about either when we think about international adoptions and this idea of like having to then become a citizen to the country that you're sort of forced to go to. I don't know, there's just like a lot of really interesting ideas that are being presented in this book. So I highly recommend it. It's phrased as a poetic memoir. I think it's very heavy on the poetry side, so honestly this could have just been called a book of poetry with like a singular theme, and I think that would work as well. So if you're someone who's interested in that type of work, I highly recommend this book. The next book that I read for the Sealey challenge in my last week was African Poetry by Uli Beer. I don't know how to pronounce this person's name, and I tried to find this book. I think it's out of print. It's from the 60s. It actually came from the Memphis City Library, so sorry, not sorry. But this is a book that has been on my shelf for years, and I used this book to fulfill the challenge of reading a book of poetry that was translated. I really enjoyed this. It has poems from lots of different African nations, and I thought that was very fascinating. A lot of the poems were either religious songs or just general like folk poems and sayings that would be transmuted throughout the culture. I didn't rate this book because it's not in Goodreads, but if I were to rate it, it would probably be about 3 stars. primarily because the person who compiled this book is not African. And, you know, there's this tendency in Western cultures to lump all of Africa together as one continent and one country and one culture, and that's just not the case. And I think that's something that was missing from this book, was some of the cultural context behind some of the songs, because you had people from you know, the Shosha tribe and Yoruba religious practices and things like that, where it's like, I don't see the connection between these things other than the fact that they're African, and I don't think that that's necessarily a good enough reason to lump some of these poems and songs together into the same category. So if you happen to find it, you know, I think it's a really interesting read. But I think in general, this book did make me think about what books from Africa have I read. I really haven't read that many. I think I could count on one hand the number of books I've read by an author from Africa, and that is a problem. I am very much someone who reads primarily from Western traditions, and I need to break out of that. I talked about this a little bit, I think it was in my May wrap up, where I noticed I also don't read a lot of books by Asian authors. So yeah, I'm someone who prides herself on reading diversely, and I noticed I am missing two massive continents that I just don't read books from. So I gotta work on that. Next up, we have an Imagist anthology. This was put together by Bob Blaisdell. This is another book that I've had on my shelves for years, and I really enjoyed this. I think I rated this one 3 stars as well, because it is an anthology, so I didn't necessarily love all of the poems that were in here, but the first section of this book I really loved. And I'm looking for the poet that really stuck out to me. Richard Aldington, who I'd never heard of before, but I loved his poems. I just thought they were so stark. And that is the main concept with Imagist poetry, is about making things an image, making them concrete, making them more realistic, and not really expounding too much on the meaning behind it. I love poetry like that. I love poetry that is very concrete, because I like to be able to figure out the meaning behind some of the images that are being presented. Towards the end of the book, though, it did become a little bit repetitive, and I think there were parts of it that, I don't know, to be quite honest, like, it just wasn't working for me. Something about the tone and the voice in it, it felt a little bit like Lifetime movie-ish, you know, very like Hallmark greeting card kind of thing. And again, that's not the kind of poetry that I like. But first half was really strong, and now I know if I'm looking for more classic or canonized forms of poetry, I think the Imagist poets are definitely people I'm gonna start looking to. All right, the last book that I read for the Sealey Challenge is Equilibrium by Tiana Clark. I read this book last year, and I did not like it at all. But I kept it because at that point I didn't really have a system for unhauling books. I reread this and I loved it. It was so powerful, and there's something to be said about reading a book at different points in your life and seeing how the book has changed and how the book has changed you. And this is a book that did that for me. I think I re-rated it 4 or 5 stars. I just found it to be so powerful. I found it, like, so many of the poems were so prevalent, so prescient for the time that we're living in right now. And I think a lot of people have just discovered Columbus, that Black Lives Matter. But she was writing about this stuff years ago. And it just goes to show that these conversations we're having this summer in relation to COVID, in relation to Black Lives Matter, these are not new conversations, but there is a huge section of our population that is new to the conversations. And there needs to be framework on how we can talk about that, because in a lot of ways it feels like people like Tiana Clark, like Denez Smith, like Morgan Parker, poets like that have to catch people up, and that's not their responsibility. They've been talking about this. It's our responsibility as readers to go back and do the research and go back and reread stuff we didn't catch the first time and do that internal work for ourselves. So I really liked this book. I highly recommend that you guys pick this up, especially if you're seeking to get into poetry that has more of a critical lens. And I think it's also just really beautiful poetry. There's a lot of biblical imagery in here as well that I forgot about. And I think maybe that's why I didn't like it, because I'm kind of going through this spiritual journey right now. But a couple years ago, anything that had anything to do with Christianity, I was not about. I was just like, I need that stuff to get far away from me. So I think getting to reread some of this stuff, it really did help me in a lot of ways. So there are a few lines that I really loved in this book, and one of the stanzas comes from this poem called Particle Fever, which I thought was really strong. And the line says, "What we speak into existence like a drum beat of what makes us, give me a plane ride to question myself." My struggles with Christianity can be summed up in that stanza. I wanted permission to ask questions, and I was never allowed that permission. And I think that's something that I really appreciated about Tiana's work. And also about, the Poet X with Elizabeth Acevedo is, having these women ask really deep questions about God and what it means to be God, to be in the universe, to exist. Those are not questions, particularly if you're a woman, that are readily welcomed by religious people. And it's a shame, because I think rather than allowing for a deepening of an understanding of faith, it shuns people and it makes them feel like they're wrong for wanting to know more. So that is something that really spoke to me. And then there's this other poem called Bear Witness, which is just, this poem is so good. The last stanza of the poem just like hit me like a ton of bricks. "I've been standing by water my whole damn life, trying to get saved." The layer upon layer of imagery there. And as someone who grew up near the water, who is most at peace when I can go swimming, when I can, sit by the beach, when I can go to a pool, who grew up watching people be baptized at the beach, in a pool, in the baptismal at church, but always feeling like because of who I was as a person, because of the way that my brain worked, I was somehow removed from salvation. I wasn't a good enough Christian, even though I did everything right. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't date. I'd never even kissed a boy till I was in my 20s. On paper, I was doing everything right, but because I asked so many questions, I just felt like I was never enough. And that feeling really pushed me away from the church. I don't know that I'll ever go back to church. My husband and I have talked about going to services somewhere, but I know that that is a feeling that I never want to experience again. And that, I think, is a big fear of mine when it comes to going to church, that I might get again if I go to a church where I just I start thinking critically about what's being said and I don't agree with it. Because people are so afraid to have these uncomfortable conversations with each other, and because people get so defensive when someone pushes back on what they're thinking, I'm afraid of a disconnection, and I'm afraid of losing my salvation, if you will, because my concept of faith is just so big, and sometimes I feel like there's not enough space for it in a church setting. So anyway, this book, y'all should buy it. I don't know if it's available anymore because I know it was a limited release, but if it is, you should get it because it's amazing. I also listened to one audiobook. It was not a book of poetry, but it was an audiobook. So this book was Crux by Jean Guerrero. I did not really like this book. I don't think I've rated it yet, but I will, and I'm gonna give it 2 stars. This might be a situation where the audiobook just wasn't good, where I might have really enjoyed it if I had read the physical copy of the book, but I don't know, man. I just found the narrator's voice to be kind of pretentious. I think the parts that I really enjoyed were the parts where the author went deep into her family history, which was the main purpose of the book, because it talks about her experiences as, you know, a Latina who's living this life across multiple borders in the US and in Latin America. I don't know though, it just something about listening to it. And then there was also this weird music playing in the background that I felt like just kind of made everything sound like a telenovela, which isn't bad, but maybe that medium just wasn't the format for it. I do wonder if maybe I had seen it as a documentary format, or if I had read a physical copy of the book, if my feeling on this would be very different. So I don't know, take with that what you will. The writing's good. I can't say that her language is bad. I can't say that, you know, the way that she depicts the different events in her life is bad, because it's not. It's all very well written and it's like well paced. Something about the tone of the author or the tone of the narrator just was not clicking with me. However, I read a different audiobook, and this one was by Michelle McNamara, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. That's what it is. Okay. I really loved this book. I think I rated it 4 stars or 5 stars. I found this book to be so fascinating, and there's been a lot of conversations about defunding the police, about all cops being bad. I am not going to sit here and say that I think cops are 100% good and that Blue Lives Matter, because I am not a Blue Lives Matter supporter. That phrase did not exist until people started saying Black Lives Matter. Police officers have the most power in the judicial system because they're allowed to become judge, jury, and executioner, and there's no legal recourse that happens to them. In no other profession is that allowed to happen. So I want to make that really clear. Like, there are issues with policing in the way that it's done in the United States. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that there isn't. But when I read books like this and read about people like the Golden State Killer, who was a cop, by the way, I just think about, like, in our society as it is set up right now, if we were to defund the police, what happens to people like that who are victims of the sexual violence that he perpetrated, who are victims of murders that people commit? You know, does our country start turning into the purge and now suddenly everything's legal and we can triage as much as we can? I do feel like in some ways there have to be some massive societal shifts that need to take place. And that's not to say that that thinking hasn't already happened, because there's plenty of resources available to what a world can look like without policing. But I live in a red county in a red state and I have like 3 different gun shops next to me. So I think about this concept of like the police no longer existing, but what do we have to replace it? Now, maybe if the defunding happened in a way that was more systematic, that then put funding into other resources, that's a concept I can get behind. But I also recognize that I am someone who has had primarily neutral and positive experiences with police officers. My husband can't say the same. A lot of my students can't say the same. A lot of my friends can't say the same. So I think my opinion in this ultimately is one of privilege, and therefore, in the grand scope of things, not necessarily the opinion that should be looked at. But this book really made me think about the role of police and what good can come of police, but at what cost does that good come, right? Because at the end of the day, the Golden State Killer was a police officer, and I do think the reason why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long was because he had access to police procedural methods and knew what he was working against, compared to a regular Joe Schmo serial killer who might have some idea, but not the same level of that idea. And it's not like he was Dexter killing only bad guys. He was murdering and raping women all across California for nearly a decade. And yet at the same time, he was caught by police officers. But it was only until he was significantly older and they had to use a really strange breach of privacy in order to catch him. So you see how complicated this gets? You see how much of a struggle this becomes? I love books that make me think like this, that make me think about the complexities of the society that we're living in, and that's why I rated this book really high. I think besides that, Michelle McNamara, who died while writing this book, pieced together so many different pieces of information and rolled it out in a chunkable way to where I did not feel overwhelmed by police procedures that were discussed in the book. I think she put together an incredible work, and she's the one who coined the phrase the Golden State Killer. So I do think to a certain extent she did not solve the case necessarily, but she had clearly a big impact on the way that the case was discussed in popular culture at large, even though in the book police departments did not necessarily agree with that idea. I think it's kind of hard to ignore her impact. So there was also a very touching ending, I think an author's note by her husband, Patton Oswalt, who's one of my favorite comedians, and he just talked about, you know, the work that she put into the book. So yeah, I don't know, I might get a lot of shit for making this video and this commentary on this book. So that's pretty much all I read for the month of August. If you'd like to see the other books that I read, don't forget to check out my first 2 Sealey Challenge videos. They'll be linked in the cards at some point. All the books that I talked about are linked in the description box down below. I post videos every Wednesday and Sunday, sometimes Fridays. You can find me on all social media platforms as @ShellyFlowers. All right, ciao y'all.